Good afternoon everybody. I'd like to welcome you here to Motu's Research Roundtable. The subject for today is thoughts on climate change in a post-COVID world. Motu is a non-profit economic research think tank, and we're rated by RePERC as one of the 10 significant think tanks in the world. So it's clear that we're living in unprecedented times, and it is essential now more than ever that we gather and have these well-reasoned discussions and debates around these critical issues that we're facing not only here in New Zealand but all over the planet. It is our intention that these seminars continue our contribution to the debate by engaging the best minds in the business and having these conversations both here around the table and with you, our virtual audience. It's befitting that for this first Motu Research Roundtable that we have our own Susie Kerr, Motu's founder, as our first presenter. Susie is currently the Chief Economist at the Environmental Defence Fund in New York, and she's had numerous posts, including part of the Interim Climate Change Commission here in New Zealand. Susie has had a long career as a researcher for both domestic and international climate change policy, with a special emphasis on emissions pricing and land use. Susie is a visionary thinker and a force for good. And she'll be joined today by our panel of experts all assembled here. And you at home also have an opportunity to put your comments in the chat. We'll have time, hopefully after the debate, for a few questions from you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panellists for today. They are, in order, we have here firstly Tom Pettit, to the left here. Tom, if you could raise your hand. Tom is a Sustainability Manager at Wellington City Council and leads a small team endeavouring to make Wellington the coolest little carbon zero capital. Next to him we have sitting Jake Roos, who is an who's an expert in carbon reduction strategy, particularly in local government. He operates as an independent consultant. Next to Jake is Anna Broadhurst. She's a veteran climate change negotiator, a survivor of the Paris negotiations. She's had a past dabbling in the carbon market and domestic policy settings, and now climate change advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Next to Anna we have Kelly Forster. She's the Program Director of He Waka Eke Noa, which is Primary Sector Climate Action Partnership. It was set up last year to develop a farm-level framework that will equip farmers and growers to reduce emissions and respond to a changing climate. We have Dr. Judy Lawrence. She's a Senior Research Fellow at the New Zealand Climate Change Research Institute, Victoria Uni in Wellington. She's the Director of Pearce Consulting Limited and Climate Change Commissioner. Her career traverses land use management, natural hazards and climate change policy, mitigation and adaptation, and practice at all levels of governance. Her academic work focuses on decision making under uncertainty and identifying institutional enablers to facilitate robust decision making, especially for addressing the biggest challenge of all, climate change. Judy is a coordinating lead author for the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. And finally we have Ben. Ben Gleisner is an economist, environmentalist and social entrepreneur. He has a master's in environmental economics from Vic University, where he focused on climate change policy. He then spent 7 years at the New Zealand Treasury, where he worked on domestic climate change policy and the UNFCCC international climate negotiations. While at Treasury, Ben led the development of the Living Standards Framework, which underpins the current government's wellbeing agenda. Ben left Treasury in 2012 to found a tech startup, which he's now taken to the UK under the brand Kogo. Kogo helps consumers understand their real-time carbon footprint, and this feature will be launching in their New Zealand app later on this year. So without further ado, I'd like to cede the floor to Susie. Thank you so much, Susie, for coming in today.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Ruth. So I want to talk today about some thoughts that I've been having. Sorry, is the slide up? Yeah, great. thinking about what COVID means for climate and for the work that we all do around climate. So what is the same, and we should just keep doing what we were doing before? What is new and different, and therefore how should we possibly change what we do in response to that? So what's the same? So a lot of stuff is really the same. There's always a tendency in a crisis to think we've got to throw it all up and start again and try something different, but actually we've still got the same urgency to reduce global greenhouse gases. The short-term reductions that we're experiencing as a result of COVID and slowdown are exactly that, they're short-term. We have to have those levels of reductions on and on over time in order to achieve the goals that we're looking for. And they're the wrong sort of short-term reductions. We want long-term reductions that actually are attractive and move us to a better world. The potential solutions have not really changed. There are some subtle changes in them, but basically they're the same sorts of things that we know need to happen and that still need to happen. We've still got a lot of uncertainty about the best ways forward. So we need research, we need evaluation, we need experimentation. And we need to be thinking in an adaptive sort of way and think about multiple possible pathways forward. We still unfortunately have free riding. We're not suddenly in some brilliant world where everybody's going to cooperate. So we still face the same challenges, free riding and lobbying of powerful interests. And you can see that playing out. It's extremely obvious in the United States, but it's true all over the world. So what is different? Well, unfortunately, one thing that's really different is that we're going to have less money going forward. So people have been very focused on the spending possibilities of stimulus, but of course, we're spending an enormous amount both on COVID directly and also on immediate fiscal stimulus. That means that over the next 10 years, we're going to have a lot less money available. A lot of countries never had fiscal headroom, a lot of developing countries, and those that did have really used it up. We have higher job and business turnover. And that means there's a lot of unemployed people, there's a lot of unemployed capital. That's obviously extremely painful, but it also means that as we come out of this recession, there'll be a lot of opportunities for change. So while we would have liked to avoid it, given that we have a recession and we are going to come out of it, might take a little while, then we can take advantage of that moving forward. And finally, and this is incredibly visible in the United States, I haven't followed the conversation so much in New Zealand, but the inequality and racism have become really highlighted issues. And the huge protests in New York pass 6 blocks away from where I live. We listen to the helicopters every night. This is on everybody's conversation all the time. So health inequalities are being incredibly visible, and the same thing with the unemployment. It is not hitting all of us equally. It's hitting some people much harder than others. So what else is different? Recognition of air pollution damage. So there's very clear linkage between where COVID-19 is hitting and where air quality is poor. That's statistically extremely obvious. It's not clear if that's just causal, that people who have been experiencing bad air quality are more vulnerable to COVID-19, or if it's actually that the same people are suffering from different sources of inequality, different causes of deprivation that are contributing both to them being more sick and them experiencing more air quality problems. There's also, this is getting a bit more speculative, at least in some circles, there's a bit more of a shift in terms of thinking about how we relate to nature. So there's quite a lot of conversation, particularly in the NGO community, around zoonotic diseases and how zoonotic, those are diseases that come from animals, may be emerging more as we humans go further and further into animal habitats, and we lose that balance and we lose biodiversity. So that's something that is making some people think differently. In some circles, and again I say some circles, there's more acceptance of active government and more recognition of how places with strong institutions and with cooperative people are doing better. And New Zealand is held up as an example all over the world in this space. And you should be very proud about what you do, even if I know that some of that is sort of luck. But people are looking to that cooperative experience and thinking that maybe there's something that they can learn. And there's a global shift in power and influence. And the US, as you know, is not coming through this with shining colours. China is trying to take as much advantage as they can out of doing better and being more active in developing countries that are struggling. And people are looking at New Zealand. Everybody is aware of New Zealand with completely disproportionate influence. We've always been leaders in climate change space. People like Anna, people like Judy have always been leaders in the space, but we're really highly visible now and we can take advantage of that. So I want to talk about what we can do differently through 4 different lenses: efficient climate policy, equitable, supporting developing countries, and possibly, and I'm getting out of my economic space here, a new narrative and way of thinking and talking about climate. So in terms of efficient climate policy, there's been a lot of really good work about stimulus and green investment, so in green recovery, how we can identify investments in climate-friendly activities that were almost ready to be invested in before, and now there's a little bit more of a fiscal push that can push those over the boundary. So they're not completely new investments that no one would have ever considered. They're ones that we wanted to do anyway. This is the opportunity to potentially do that. It's also important as we worry about protecting businesses, and this is not a New Zealand specific comment, there are some industries that are really just getting going here and trying to make sure that they in particular don't fall over as a result of a general recession. And new businesses often are very vulnerable because they don't have the capital behind them yet. Also, there's extra impetus now to avoid damaging spending. So we've long talked about fossil fuel subsidies. There's a lot of other implicit subsidies that go towards damaging activity. Now we're short of money. This is another argument to stop doing that stuff. And an extra impetus for taxing or charging polluters for payment. So polluter pays. So efficient levels of emissions pricing. New Zealand is very unusual that we have at least an emissions price of some significance, but we know it's way too low relative to any estimates of what will actually be associated with proper change. And other environmental taxes are possible. And when I say plastics, I don't just mean plastic bags. I mean plastics on a broader spectrum. And I've got in there a long-term bugbear of mine, reducing the free allocation of the ETS. I know in the last round of reform that wasn't particularly actively considered. There's no evidence of leakage that anybody can find, and it is terrifically expensive to taxpayers. So we should reassess that. And I'm not just talking New Zealand again, this is something we're trying to shift in the debate more generally. And this comes up as an equity issue as well, of course, because any money that is being used for free allocation is not available to help disadvantaged communities. As we run out of money, non-spending options also become more and more important. So one of those is stable governance. If you have an ETS and people believe it's going to persist, it's going to be much more effective. If you have a budgeting process and people believe in that budgeting process for carbon budgeting, then they will start planning as though they are on a transition path, and a lot of stuff will begin to happen. So getting people to believe that those governance processes are stable and that we are actually heading towards low emissions can be terrifically effective all on its own without having to spend money. That predictability of the direction of movement. Considering regulations instead of having to pay for things or providing positive incentives will be more and more attractive in places that are short of money. So, for example, one very current issue is concern about the damage that's being done by pine plantations, and concern that the ETS, particularly as the price goes high, will make it terrifically attractive to plant enormous amounts of pine. And Motu itself has modelled the country sort of being covered in pine, which is kind of a cautionary tale, if nothing else. If we don't want that to happen, we have to think about how to stop that. You could pay people to do natives, not pine, or you could stop them from doing pine. And one of those is free to taxpayers, and one of them is really costly. So the fact that we don't have much money might shift that balance. Considering nudges are super cheap. We've got people travelling at home more. Can we encourage New Zealanders to keep doing that even when we can hop back on those big aeroplanes? And finally, something that is super challenging, but helping the private sector as they come out of the recession to coordinate and shift their path of investment towards green investment. And as an economist, we always sort of think of the private sector, or I always used to, think of them as these sort of super rational optimizers, particularly larger companies. But when you start working with companies, you realize how untrue that is, and how when they have to coordinate, they all get together to have a meeting, and then they all sort of sit there and look at each other waiting for somebody to take the initiative. If they don't have a common vision of where they're going to go, it's very hard for them to coordinate. And that's something that government doesn't have to do the investment, but they can help bring people together and help them actually coordinate. It's an important role for government. In terms of equitable climate policy, focus on jobs and training. We have a lot of unemployed people all over the world. One of the things that happens, particularly when younger people are unemployed, is that they go back to education. Let's make that education prepare them for a new, cleaner, greener economy, and not just for the older economy. We talk about investment during stimulus, and people instantly think of shovel ready. They think of concrete and physical stuff. What about human capital? We can invest in human capital. We need more human capital, and that's more equitable because it's more dispersed in terms of its value. And it's really focused on jobs, which is what we really want. Enable gracious exit of people. Some high-emitting industries are really struggling. Fracking is falling apart. Yay! Let's help them get out, help them get into something new while they're already down. And down for reasons that are nothing to do with climate policy. It's just for other reasons. So help those communities, help to make that a positive experience for them so that they don't just struggle and they don't rise again to fight us all over again. Focusing on the communities who can't adjust though, because some of those struggling industries employ highly skilled people who are highly mobile. Those people will go and get jobs somewhere else. They'll move into other jobs without any big problems. Other industries, coal mines in Pennsylvania are kind of a classic example of this. They may struggle in a very long-term sense, and you might really need to focus on them. Use climate policy to address the existing inequality and racism and not to increase it. And again, as economists, we're always taught you separate out your policies, you focus on efficient policies, and then you have separate policies that deal with distribution. And we all know that in a second best world, you actually have to deal with multiple objectives within one policy. So bringing that very active mindset, which we already do to a certain extent in New Zealand, but doing that more and more is, I think, critical. Developing countries are struggling far more than anyone else. And I haven't been following New Zealand media closely, but in the US, they're almost invisible. But I work with people all over the world, and it's really dire in a lot of countries. And they don't have fiscal headroom. They are desperately hoping that others outside are going to come in and help them with recovery. And they're struggling just with basic healthcare at the moment. But this is an opportunity for us to be our cooperative, generous selves, and also at the same time nudge and support and help those countries go towards low emissions. Some of the governments are now desperate, so policies and interventions they would have resisted in the past may now be possible. They may be willing to fight against some of those vested interests who've blocked movement. Fiscal needs are totally acute, so they may be open to emissions pricing or things that bring them revenue. And co-benefits are really top of mind, particularly air quality is really, really something that is taken much more seriously than it was previously. So a couple of directions, and Anna's already aware of this, some of the things that we've been thinking about. So one is that there are emission reductions in some of these countries, locking those in as we do the revisions to nationally determined contributions and targets under the Paris Agreement, but locking them in by providing support that will actually help them keep their emissions down, but keep their emissions down in a positive way, setting them onto a longer term transition. And so again, EDF working with New Zealand and Switzerland and trying to persuade the Chilean government is looking at how we can create models to make that easier, more effective, more cooperative. And we can align those to recovery possibilities. So the example we're looking at is in Chile. So what we're trying to do in Chile is design a way in which New Zealand and Switzerland can support Chile to phase out its coal more rapidly, electrify its transportation, improve its land sector, and by doing so, overachieve its Paris target, which is already pretty ambitious, and that then New Zealand can take some of the credit for that in terms of achieving our own Paris target. Doing that on a super large scale where it really makes a difference in Chile. And as we're trying to do that, we've got all of these issues in our minds. How do we work with Chile to create jobs that will help them with their recovery? How do we reduce inequality, make sure that our interventions are helping them reduce inequality? They had massive street protests late last year, October, which caused the COP that was going to be in Santiago to be moved at very, very short notice. So there are big concerns about inequality. There are big concerns about air quality, which is tied into a lot of those issues. They are open to emissions pricing. They have a tax. This might be a moment where they could expand it. And they're a place where there's some potential for innovation and new options that New Zealand could learn from if Chile, for example, experimented with using ammonia and hydrogen for shipping that arrives in Chile. Maybe that's something New Zealand could also explore doing. And finally, a new narrative. So I think that it's become, we've all kind of known these things, but it's become much more visible. Humans are deeply interdependent on a global scale, but also we're mostly cooperative and kind. Mostly people's response to COVID has been to support each other and to care. And I love the be kind thing that New Zealand has really pushed. And then there's a recent book by Rutger Bregman that basically pulls together in a very journalistic way some of the evidence that says actually humans are, by and large, cooperative, friendly, nice people, which I've always believed. Also, businesses are fragile when society is fragile. And that, again, is really obvious in the current situation. A business cannot survive in a society that is falling apart. And this is terrifically visible in the US. So some interesting work that Rebecca Henderson at Harvard Business School is doing. She's just released an excellent book, also very readable, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, looking at going back to older ways of thinking about business, where it wasn't just about bottom lines, but it was about business working within society so that in the long term, they would be profitable and sustainable and thrive. So can we harness these different human cooperation, business having a longer term views to actually address the root causes of the inequality and climate change, so that we're not always trying to force people to change, but we're just shifting society from underneath. And finally, and sort of even further from my core area of expertise, humans' dependence on nature is much more visible. And these zoonotic diseases are coming from nature and they're having extraordinary effects from us. We cannot believe that we can completely dominate nature and live separately from it. And potentially we need to think more about getting a better balance between humans and environment and nature, not to protect nature, but to protect ourselves. And so I think, a book in this space is Anne Salmon's excellent book, Tears of Rangi, where she really talks about the difference between the sort of dominant Western paradigm of thinking about God, people, actually white males, etc., down to bugs, and compare that with a more relationship-based view, which is a Māori view, but also a very common view in many cultures. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you so much. So, just kicking off around the table, has anybody got something front of mind they'd like to share or a question they'd like to ask of Susie? Please put your little red buzzer forward. And Ben, you'd like to kick off for this afternoon. Thank you.
It's been like 11 years since I was doing UN work, but can you describe Article 6 to me, just so I can understand?
Sorry, this is acronym soup. So Article 6 is the new thing for trading between countries. So Chile overachieves its target, New Zealand gets some of the credit for it, and therefore New Zealand achieves its target using some international. Yeah. We try not to talk about international markets now because it's more a cooperative relationship rather than a sort of a credits offsets type approach. It's still an evolution.
I will just follow that up. I agree with your explanation. Very nicely put, given the state of the tricky state of the negotiations right now. But Susie, I'm interested in your sense of the extent to which the world is waiting for outcomes from Article 6 negotiations as opposed to just getting on with that market-based collaboration.
That's a really good question. And so I think there are two camps. So the camp that I am in, and that most of the Western people I talk with it in, is that we should just get on with it. That Paris is not a rules framework in the way Kyoto was, and that it's up to us to work out how to do this and then prove that we're doing it with integrity. But there are people, particularly I've seen in Asian countries, who are waiting to be told this is the right way, and if you do it this way, we'll give you credit. So there's both, and we can keep saying to them, you don't have to wait, we can make up the rules, we can just do it well. And they keep on, they sort of nod, and then they revert back to asking again, saying, but the UN rules don't exist yet. So I think we do need to get a clarity in the UN rules, even if the clarity is, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Well, while we're on the international theme, I might just get my blue out of the way, if that's okay with folks. So thank you, Susie. That was very, very interesting. It was really resonated for me that it was sort of seamless, your flow between the domestic and the international repercussions of COVID, because that's certainly how we see it in that. I might start by just reminding people what climate change work a foreign ministry actually does. It may not be so obvious. So the sort of diplomatic effort and lobbying that we lead is sort of focused on encouraging other countries to take ambitious action. You know, recognising New Zealand can't do it on its own. New Zealand acting on its own really makes no sense for New Zealand really either. So it is about encouraging others. So we do seek to leverage the leadership the New Zealand government has shown, but we also, it sort of encompasses the rules-based negotiations and the UNFCCC, but also things like the International Maritime Organisation, and then some specific issues like fossil fuel subsidy reform, on which we are sort of very active campaigners. Another aspect of our work is supporting Pacific resilience. I'm really pleased that you've highlighted the vulnerability of countries, and these countries in our neighbourhoods are hugely vulnerable, hugely under pressure right now, and that has immediate sort of implications for the geopolitical stability of the region, and and that is our backyard, so of big concern to us. But nonetheless, one of New Zealand's climate change ambitions is to mobilise finance into the Pacific, making good our own commitments under the Paris Agreement, which are focused on the Pacific through our ODA program, but also encouraging other countries, other partners, multilateral banks, the Green Climate Fund, everyone we can get to listen to recognise just how vulnerable the Pacific is and just how much money and support is needed. And a third element of our work is supporting New Zealand's transition to a low emissions future. We bundle up in that New Zealand's implementation of the Paris Agreement. So that is things like communication of our nationally determined contribution and supporting the development and communication of our long-term low emissions development strategy. And then some technical work as well, supporting those who are negotiating the carbon markets work in the UNFCCC and other activity going on to sort of understand how the market might evolve over time and may be of interest to New Zealand in the future. So we are facing some challenges. First of all, 2020 is not the year of ambition that we thought it was going to be. Nothing like it. Climate change and the big commitments and Paris Agreement milestones for this year are slipping down the agenda globally. And resources everywhere in every ministry, including our own, are being redeployed to other things, so that is a challenge. Our meeting schedule is disrupted. We won't be going to Glasgow in November this year. We have fingers crossed that by this time, the same time next year we are back in that sort of COP process, but that's an unknown. We have New Zealand until very recently, we've been doing extremely well eliminating COVID with very firmly shut borders, and watching others begin to move, to reassemble in meetings, and wondering, what's going to happen if we're not quite in that game. As I've mentioned, the Pacific, that's been a very pressing challenge for us, and something that, we feel an enormous responsibility, particularly around realm countries, and sort of a lot of deep thinking going on about what sort of thing can be done to help. And you would have seen in the media that there's discussion of the bubble with some of the realm countries. That's sort of one manifestation of many things that are being attempted to try to be helpful in the region. But for INFAT, one of the real big challenges is that we're not in a post-COVID world. Our diplomatic network is out there living lockdowns and infection and, really difficult working environments. So our mode of work, relying on our posts and our diplomats to lobby others and to make démarches and things, all of that is being rethought now. And the less money thing, it's already evident, particularly in the Pacific, which is a shame. But we have some opportunities. The Green Recovery, that is our platform for advocating ambitious climate action. We've got good credentials on climate change architecture, and we're sort of pivoting that now to begin to talk about ambitious action on climate change, not so much through the lens of NDCs and targets, but through green recovery. And actually people listen a lot more than they do to targets. So, that is an opportunity. For New Zealand, we are looking at a trade-led recovery, and we have a framework that allows us to identify and support exporters that consistent with New Zealand's long-term economic goals, and to leverage a New Zealand brand that is only enhanced by our recent COVID management. So there's an opportunity for us there. Foreign policy engagement, right now, borders and vaccines are a big priority, but we're also able to talk about the importance of multilateralism. Lots of people are thinking in the narrow sense of the World Health Organization, all of the multilateral institutions, including the UN Equitable, they all really matter, and we're getting an opportunity to talk about that. I've talked about the Pacific, and I've talked about the COP. I'm just saying one more thing. We work in a world of virtual diplomacy now. We get horrible, you mentioned time zones, and New Zealand gets horrible time zones for meetings, but we are able to wield out more of our big guns. Ministerial travel was a really difficult thing to organise, but ministerial participating in a Zoom call, that's not such a big thing. So the opportunities are there as well, and we're just getting on with it.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Would you like to say something now?
Yeah, I thought I'd follow on, speaking more from that perspective of implementing our domestic vision around climate change emission reduction programs, and I'm here to representing Wake Kenoa, which is the Primary Sector Climate Action Partnership. And as you said when you introduced me, the vision of that partnership is to enable farmers and growers to take action to reduce emissions and respond to a changing climate. And I remember distinctly being in a Zoom meeting with the steering group for this project in April, with leaders across the agriculture sector bodies, being in the room and talking about how COVID was affecting their industry, in that moment in time, and the disruptions were very varied. From not being able to get pickers for different fruit products to the impacts in processing, and it was combined, with the droughts and things that were happening. So there were a lot of pressures on the industry. But what struck me in that conversation was those leaders, the call to stay the course on this program, and seeing the long-term vision of driving further improvements in our agriculture sector and its environmental footprint, and I guess continuing to leverage that brand. And I do find it really interesting that our response to COVID has kind of boosted our brand even further. But yeah, I guess just reflecting the fact that the industry's recognised that this is not a time to take the foot off the pedal in terms of our environmental response or our response to climate change. It's time to stay the course and dig in.
Thank you, Kelly. Jake.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk, Susie. That was great. For my part, I'll just talk about what I'm up to, and then to the global context, and back to what you presented earlier. So I'm primarily working with Greater Wellington Regional Council, particularly on their climate change mitigation work. They committed to a carbon neutral goal for 2030 for their organisation as a whole, which involved all sorts of investments, all the public transport, and also by proxy areas like Centreport as well. So they have a majority shareholding in. And certainly the wheels of local government, Tom will talk through this, don't turn particularly fast, and then they slow down a little bit more during lockdown. But I was pleasantly surprised that they did get moving again, did adapt to the new way of working reasonably quickly, and the work continued all through our lockdown. And also, was encouraging was that the elected members and senior staff didn't decide to say, oh, well, we'll just forget about all that stuff we discussed last year, it's all different now. The focus on climate change mitigation was still very much there. So that was quite heartening. So now we've got to, and also not just local government, the central government kept going as well, and passed changes to the Resource Management Act and the Emissions Trading Scheme, and I think Product Stewardship. There's an announcement about that too, which is a bit of a breakthrough on the waste side of things. So that's good to see that we're still moving. But in the global context, of course, the picture is not nearly so rosy, and I think there's a strong link between the countries, the US sticks out, of course, that have been undermining science, particularly climate science, for many, many years to suit their own political purposes, have, of course, rife with denial of other forms of science. It was a very natural leap to go from denying climate science to denying the reality of the situation around COVID and other things like anti-vaxxer movement and such like. And really, I think what the pandemic has done is just laying bare where all of the weaknesses around the world in governance and basically civil society. And but of course, it's cast New Zealand in a very good light because we obviously doing better in that regard. And I think that's helped us develop a kind of soft power. Not superpower, but soft power, that is an enormous advantage that we should, of course, continue to take advantage of by not just getting our own self sorted out and acting as a leader by example, but actually being able to help others around the world as well. I think, a lot of people have looked to the US for a long time to show leadership on climate change, and I think now they'll have to look elsewhere, and perhaps that's New Zealand.
Thank you, Jake. Maybe I should respond briefly.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I think I really agree with what you're saying, Jake, and it's so important. And in the US, there's a really virulent debate around science, and the whole COVID thing has brought this, it's just brought a lot of fuel to the side of those who are in favour of science. And EDF, as you might be aware, we're a very science-based organisation. We have a lot of PhD scientists on staff who are really fighting on these sorts of things. And I hope that this is a moment where it can bring science back into US policy making, possibly in a different way. I think there has been some arrogance among experts in the past, which has led to some of the current problems, but hopefully it can move forward. And in terms of the US taking leadership, again, I know that there are people who would really love them to do that, particularly if the election has a certain sort of result in November. But it's going to take a while to build that leadership again, even if they do try.
Fantastic. Judy. Yeah, kia ora tātou, and thank you for coming home.
Kia ora.
I really resonated with your comments. But I want to take us back to COVID, and coming from an academic discipline which likes to see what we can learn from other analogues of what's happening in the world around climate change. And one of the things that we've learned from COVID is that we better understand what exponential growth means. It's fundamental to the way viruses spread throughout the world and in our own country, and it is why we went hard and fast. And the impacts of climate change have similar characteristics. Those impacts are driven by the emissions, which we're trying to get down through our international agreements and through the work that's been done in New Zealand and government, and also by the Climate Change Commission, which I'm commissioner of, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We have an enormous opportunity in the recovery process to reflect on what we've learned about how a virus spreads and how climate change spreads in terms of the impacts, because we can do something about the impacts in New Zealand much more effectively than we can about reducing our emissions globally. Not to put aside the value that the MFAT operates with and trying to find novel ways in which we can do that internationally. And so looking into New Zealand, and I'll put my Climate Change Commission hat on now, we developed a set of 6 principles which could be used when making decisions about the investment in our recovery. And they're on the website, but just briefly, principle 1 is to consider how the stimulus investments can deliver long-term climate benefits, which is really the point you made, Susie, in your presentation, about really thinking about what could be locked in for the long term. We could actually bring forward some of the more transformational type of climate change investments that need to happen anyway. And they're the ones that is this notion you had of filtering out the dross, bringing forward the things that really matter. And of course, preparing our workforce and our capital, human capital for the jobs for tomorrow, and working in partnership with all the community to develop, to address some of those social issues that you actually that you mentioned. And maintaining the incentives to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change, and 6thly, change how we measure success. And you talked about the green economy. If we have a successful economy, it would be more green than it is now. So that sort of thing. So the work that the Commission is doing is developing the budgets and plans for achieving the targets, but we also have an advisory role that we can initiate. So if we see things happening out there, we can actually give advice to government. We don't have to wait to be asked. When we're asked, of course, we need to respond, and of course we're doing that with the NDC, the nationally defined contributions that the government has signed up to, and to see whether in fact it's going to reach 1.5 degrees C, and then what might we need to do to address that. But COVID has given us a wonderful opportunity, leaving aside the impacts on people which we must address, but to make sure that those future-proof us.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Got anything you'd like to add to that, Ben?
I think Tom was keen to touch on something. I'll go at the end.
Good to see you.
Well, I was going to build on both what Jake said and what Judy just said in a couple of ways. And first, it was to say we really do have to step back and look at how monumental the mitigation challenge is. Both Jake's and my council declared climate change emergencies last year, and we've developed an implementation plan that was just passed last week that indicates we can only get about halfway to our goals for 2030, even doing everything we have planned so far. So it really is truly monumental. But at the same time, I will say, Judy, that when you're looking at adaptation, some would say mitigation is the best form of it. so we can avoid those impacts. But I look back at the lockdown, and I think there's so much we can learn from it. Someone in my team has calculated that if everyone in Wellington who can work from home, and I know this is very hyper-local from the international conversation, but if everyone who can work from home in Wellington does, it'll save between 2 and 4% of our total greenhouse gas emissions per day work from home. So if they work 5 days, it's 10%. But it's something that people weren't comfortable with before the lockdown, but all of a sudden employers are, all of a sudden people are, all of a sudden it's a more interesting way of engaging for people. But there were some spatially unequal impacts that came out of that working from home, came out of that lockdown, where suburbs were seeing increases in spending of upwards of 30%, and our CBD was kind of hollowed out to a little extent as people were working from home or just locked out in general. So the impacts on our city systems of that were pretty monumental. And I think the big point for me is the first lockdown is estimated to save off of our annual carbon emissions for New Zealand 8%. And that's how much we have to save every single year in order to reach our targets. So we need to find a way to do that without the massive well-being impacts that we've seen as a result of lockdown. And simple things that cost nothing, like working from home, may be a key to an easy start, but we have to find a way to address the spatial inequalities of spending that results from that.
Thanks, Tom. And Ben?
Sure, I'll jump in. Thanks, and great to be here. Nice to see you, Susie. And yeah, good contributions. And from my perspective, I guess I've heard a lot about government as a solution, and no question, we are not going to be able to solve the monumental challenge that you definitely rightly say, Tom, without government involvement. I suppose after 15 years of looking at policy and looking at the sort of impact, I guess I feel like not only the headroom that you talk about, which is missing out in COVID, so I know there's not as much money in government to solve it. I do feel like there's a growing lack of concern and possibly opportunity there in individuals and businesses to be part of some of the solutions. I know you can say that maybe they've also not been, we've not also been doing the things that, is needed to be done. But I guess the idea we have behind our platform and the technology is really about, empowering individuals and businesses ultimately as well to sort of transition the economy to a sort of lower carbon one, to a sort of lifestyle that we have, whether it's working at home, whether it's doing other things in daily life, that really brings everyone into the sort of challenge of reducing footprint, of reducing climate impact. So I guess our idea is really a belief that with good information, and that's what markets are supposed to provide to people, but with good information, and we do that through collecting people's securely information on their spending data. So Kogo connects securely into people's banking information and gives them data around their carbon footprint, so in real time. But then I like the reference of nudges, because then we use behavioral science to really nudge people to sort of, understand the choices that could be there in terms of decision making. And I mean, the first thing that I looked at was my flights, my footprints. So I was launched in the UK, and we had to escape the UK because of COVID as a family in March. And I think the flight back was pretty much 2 years worth of carbon for our family. So yeah, I just think people just with that information will start making different choices, and then it's all about a behavioural change sort of program linked to a very much sense of community of I might just find my diet needs to improve and my commuting to work, but I'm with other people that are also on that journey. And so I think I guess COVID provides an opportunity of a more unified approach to sort of solutions. And I think New Zealand is actually well positioned as a leader, and others have said, to really shape what I believe is a transition to a lifestyle that's low carbon, but one that also is a well-being, maximizing life. It's not a trade-off in my mind. It's we can live low carbon and we can live well. So I'll say that.
Thanks for that, Ben. That's fantastic. We've got a question here from Grace Southon that might be one for you, Ben, to answer. Gray's asking how to make it clear the necessity of a much more rapid emission reduction without alienating people. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think part of our mission is to mainstream. We don't want to use those sort of words externally. So, but basically make it something that everyone can access. If climate change is all about pointing a finger, and I'm not thinking about my dad with a massive extinction rebellion there, pointing a finger at government and saying you're the problem and you're the solution. I think climate change needs to be something that everyone feels part of, both the problem and the solution. So I think it's about empowering people with information about their impact on climate and helping them feel like they're part of the solution, rather than just, I think at the moment, alienating people by saying it's not my issue, it's those people over there.
Just sort of to build on that, if I may, there is another question from one of our audience here, from Chris Cameron. He's asking, there's an increasing discussion about participatory democracy and its role in dealing with the critical and complex change. To what extent do you each think that this will play a part in our future governance? Anybody like to follow up on that, or is that too left field? I'm not sure.
No, it's not left field at all. It's mainstream, really.
Yeah.
The work that's been done on climate change adaptation generally, because I just want to make one point in response to your comment over here, Tom, that it's all about reduction of emissions. Whatever we do about emissions, we have impacts coming down the pipe because the atmosphere has already got the carbon dioxide in it. So we're not going to be able to avoid those ones. So we will be, at the same time as reducing our emissions, we will be having to adapt. Okay, and so the processes that have been developed through research programs over a number of years in New Zealand have actually emphasised the point that people are part of the solution and are at the centre of addressing the problem of how do we reduce our emissions and how do we respond to adaptation. And the whole notion of anticipatory adaptation has arisen out of that.
Quickly on that one, participatory democracy, I guess I know the concept and it's good, but the idea of participating in democracy, we participate in climate change every single decision we make. And I think while it's not about participating in the sort of democracy and the sort of policy settings, we will make a choice around climate, whether we go home on a bus or whether we go home on a bike or whether we eat something. So I think I'd say let's all participate in climate change through those everyday choices.
Thank you, Ben.
Can I jump in and comment on that, perhaps linking to a little bit? And the first question was about how we convince others and how we bring with us, and I think part of how we talk about it and the words that we use. And if we can talk about climate change and impact and biophysical stuff, or we can talk about impacts on people's families, their grandchildren and their livelihoods and their superannuation funds and those things. And, when you get the right words, you can connect with people and actually galvanise them to quite significant action, just as COVID has shown us around the health scare has really got people moving. When we can connect the climate crisis with people's well-being, with the words that we use, then we can galvanise action.
Yeah. So this relates quite closely to a question that was sent in earlier by Lindsay at Resilience. And she's asking, would it be good to establish regular focus on the cost of not dealing with climate change? And which I think is a very similar question in a way. So thinking about what would be the damages if we don't act. And I think that we need to do that enough to get people to take it seriously and to keep them taking it seriously. But we have to balance that with not freaking people out and causing them to be paralysed. And part of that is the sort of thing that I think Ben is talking about yes, you make them go, gosh, this is a problem. Oh, and this is something I can do about it. And I find participatory democracy a curious term. It sort of sounds like a tautology. And what is democracy if we don't participate in it? I think sometimes people think democracy is elections, and that is really not true. And there are plenty of countries with elections and no democracy. So, so I think that's an ongoing challenge to get that balance. And we all face it, those of us who work on climate change in our everyday lives. How often do you actually contemplate damages? Often enough to keep you motivated, not so often that you don't sleep at night and you can keep working. I wanted to transition on to another point, which again, sorry, Ben also raised, talked about being with others on the journey. And I think that's an interesting thing, and talking about flights, which are completely dominating of probably my entire extended family. My flights dominate my extended family's footprint. And I think Anna would relate to this. It's very hard as a climate policy diplomat to not travel because everybody else is physically present in meetings. And this is providing, our current situation is providing the opportunity to shift that dramatically, because everybody's getting used to virtual meetings, and maybe we can keep a lot of those meetings virtual. Everybody would be better off. We wouldn't have to travel. We don't waste time traveling. We don't have to travel at weird times. We just have meetings at weird times. And we can do that if we do it all together. But as anyone from New Zealand has found, you can't do that unilaterally. But this is a moment where we could try and encourage them to stick with that. And then I could move home permanently and I wouldn't have to be based in New York, which might be really nice. So, and also there's another question that came in. This one is from Z Zhang, who's a PhD student at UC Davis. So he's asking about livestock and reductions in livestock emissions as a result of COVID and a fall in production of meat. And in the US, this has been a very big issue in terms of processing facilities and so on. And he's saying, what is the longer term implication for the meat and dairy industry? And I think this is just an illustration of something that Tom was saying. We've seen these reductions as a result of COVID, but we need to not just have 8% reduction this year, we need another 8% next year and another 8% the year after. And we're not getting to do that by closing down meat processing facilities in dramatic ways and killing off lots of animals. So every sector has to think, what is the positive way of moving out of this? And the sooner you start thinking about that, the easier it's going to be. Because as everyone knows, fast change is really difficult, slow change is much easier. So that was easy.
Thank you. And I think, Jake, you had something, perhaps if you...
Yeah, I just wanted to riff off some of the things Ben was saying about behaviour change and information, and just link it back to COVID. COVID has been just a massive worldwide experiment in the limits to behavioural change. We're talking about the 8%, you know, like shut down all the flights, you know, you can't fly, you know, and really just go to extremes. So you could have had the same effect if everyone just decided not to fly anymore because it was bad for the climate. And we've seen what that gets you in terms of climate change mitigation, and the answer is not nearly enough, you know. And at the same time, if you look at places like the actual virus itself, if you look in the United States, another example, Brazil, or in a number of countries actually, where there's people that are doing the right thing and there's free riders who aren't doing the right thing, screw it up for everyone, you know. And then it's sort of like, well, if we don't all act together with a common purpose, following some clear leadership with a clear understanding of the facts of the problem and the possible solutions, then you don't achieve the outcome. So I just think it's really, I think COVID has got some really important lessons there for us about systems thinking and the limits of individual action. They're important, but only in the context of changing systems and unified purpose, essentially.
Thanks for that, Jake. And there's another question here, just to get it in before we wrap up, in fact. This is from Chris McDowell, and he's asking, how do the panellists rate our ability to model and measure emissions at the household, business, farm, community level, and the impact of small-scale mitigation efforts? Are there any obvious data gaps? And again, that may be something, I'm not sure. Kelly, is that something you can speak to?
Well, at the farm level, there are actually quite a few tools that farmers can use to measure their emissions at the farm level. And I mean, the last survey suggested that only around 10% of farmers would actually know their number. So there's a difference between what tools are available and their uptake. But the tools are there, and there's always going to be a way to improve those as more mitigations come along and get recognised in those tools. So I don't think it's a tool shortage from a rural perspective.
Right, and I'm thinking it's actually 4 o'clock on the dot, so perhaps we should wrap this particular roundtable session up at this point. We may take some feedback from our audience at home as to whether we should extend these sessions. My feeling is we probably would be would do well with another half an hour on these subjects as we start to. I mean, we can keep going. There's actually no limit, and this is our first, so we don't actually have to stop. Should we have a show? Should we have a show of hands? Who would like to carry on with this discussion?
People could obviously
Love
drop out.
She's got to go. She's got to go.
Judy Johnson and from
You do. Yeah, so we'll stick to our original plan. I think we will wrap this up after 1 hour debate, but perhaps it's a format we can look at later. And yes, Susie.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to come back to New Zealand and engage with people who have thought about all this stuff so deeply. And I found that I've had a number of meetings in New Zealand, and really you guys are at the cutting edge of thinking. And it's not always obvious when you're here, I know. So the others think they're at the cutting edge. Don't record that.
No. And I'd just like to thank you, Susie, for kicking us off with this roundtable format. I think it worked pretty well for a first time. And, it's obviously become clear to all of us here that New Zealand has a really strong role to play, actually, in developing this thinking.
Absolutely.
Our location, the fact that we're not COVID rabid at this stage and hopefully will stay that way, and the fact that we have a smaller community with the ability to trust one another. And we're very nimble as well, so you'll be aware as much as anyone of how many eyes are on us here in New Zealand at the moment. So, let's just keep these conversations happening and really start thinking about how we can provide a real meaningful contribution from this country to the rest of the world is our plan. Thank you so much for coming, everybody.
Congratulations on your first.
Oh, well, we did it. We pulled it off. Good stuff. Thank you.
We have another experiment going on
Yes.
live at the moment, where through the IPCC we're not having our next lead authors meeting. And so we've been pushing very hard to make sure that they don't just have one time zone for plenaries.
Yes.
Right? And I pushed it last night, and I got a really strong response back from my colleagues that yes, we do have to do this differently, because it's going to be the way we're going to have to do it in the future.
Yeah.
So it's a live experiment, and
We're doing all our meetings at both ends of the day, overlap, repetition.
there's still gaps.
Yeah, it's hard. It is hard, isn't it? Yeah.
We'll get there.
It's a repeat meeting.
Yes,
Yeah.
you do. Yeah.
East, west.
And not just splitting the audience, but having different subsets at different
Exactly.
times.
Because you're getting dominance of Europe.
Yes.
Yeah, well, we can't have that, can we? No, we've got we'll punch well above our weight, I'm sure, down here in New Zealand. So thanks everybody again for coming, and look forward to seeing you again, I hope. Thank you.